Well, I had quite a few comments about the oak I was using the other day, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about wood. I use the woods that are available to me here. This is a piece of ironwood. Now, I don't really build anything out of ironwood. It's incredibly hard wood, very close grain. But, most of them, they don't get to be more than about 8 inches big. It's not a big tree. What I use it for mostly are for like pins, pegs. When I put other pieces of wood together, this is ideal for that, partly because it's got a spiral grain to it. So when you split the pieces out, they spiral in when you drive them in. So it's a handy wood, but incredibly hard and hard to work with. This is the oak that I was using on that platform thing. And I just rubbed turpentine on it, because a lot of times the wood, when you first cut it, it looks real pale. But the oak gets kind of a reddish color to it, or goldish red. It's nice wood, but it is a little difficult to work with. It's great when you need something that'll take a lot of wear, because the oak is hard. But you do have to watch oak. It has a tendency to check. So if you cut a piece, you immediately have to cover the end with something. That's where I slap pine tar on them, just to keep them from checking, because otherwise they will check very quickly. But and that's even, like, this stuff is a couple years old, so it's well dried, but when you make a fresh cut, it's going to want to check. And it's nice wood, and that's what I got most of up here. I got a lot of oak. But it is, it doesn't cut bad when it's green, but once it's seasoned, that stuff is hard, like on the planer and stuff, and like running it through the table saw. She has a tendency to kick the table saw out. But if you make something out of oak and coat those ends, that stuff does last. What I do most of my projects with is this, which is ash. And again, light colored wood, but you put turpentine on, it gets kind of a rich gold color to it. Ash is good. Ash is one of my favorite woods to work with. I make my dog sleds out of ash because I really like that wood. It's straight grained, easy cutting, easy to work with. Though you do have to watch, you have to think about the grain that you're using, because you can get yourself into a bind with that. Now here's a piece of wood that I seldom have anything to do with. I have very few of these growing up here, and it's weird wood. There's more when you get down along the river, there's more of it, but it's hackberry. Now, it's interesting wood, and it isn't going to be too apparent, but it's got an unusual grain in that it's a wavy grain, like shredded wheat almost. Actually, fairly heavy wood, pretty hard. There again, I kicked the table saw out just cutting this. But interesting wood. This I happened to get from when we were at Sodbusters days. They were cutting mostly elm, but then they cut some hackberry. So I thought, well, I'll try to do something with this. I think it'd make like a good hammer handles, because it's got flex because of that wavy grain, but yet really solid, good piece of wood. But I know I've cut hackberry that was kind of green, cut it into a 1/4 inch square, and I was able to tie a knot in it that just you could pull tight. Interesting stuff. I make my dog sleds out of ash, but I've always thought, like I say, this is heavy, but a dog sled out of hackberry, might be a pretty good deal because it would be really resilient. It could take a lot of odd stresses just because of that grain. But ash is what I tend to use for a lot of stuff because there you can get big boards. But what I'm planing today is this, which is basswood. And basswood is interesting. It has very little discernible grain to it. It's a soft wood like a pine, but not nearly as splintery as a pine. Interesting wood to work with. You know, I've got quite a few of that cut. So I'm just planing some out for another project I'm doing. Kind of interesting stuff, but it's very stable wood. I know I've heard they use it a lot in furniture that will be covered with like an oak veneer. They'll use this because you can almost machine this stuff out because of the lack of discernible grain, you know, because there really isn't. Not the strongest whorl in the wood, but very flexible. And here's a little piece that I cut when I was trimming this board. And, you know, I think you could actually take and soak this and weave baskets out of it. You know, it's really flexible stuff. Not nearly as splintery as what pine is, you know, it doesn't break as easy. But it's interesting wood. And light. You know, I actually, and one thing, it doesn't, you know, it'll flex, but because of its light weight, I'm actually going to use this to make a wind charger propeller, because you don't need the strength. You need a certain amount of resilience, and the lighter the better. You know, I made a propeller out of oak one time, and that's just too much mass. You need something light. I think basswood is the trick. You know, and like I say, it isn't splintered, because the worst you can have is on a prop like that, like say on the end of the blade. You know, you have to watch so it doesn't start splintering down the long way, because that's usually how they break. But that oak one, that time the wind come up and she oversped and that thing blew, just blew. I found pieces of that laying all over. But this is light enough, a small breeze, it'll pick it up real quick. You know, it won't have that momentum of that heavy. So I think this will be the trick for that. But I've got a couple other projects I want to do with this because of, like I say, the lack of grain to it. It's easily machinable, so to do like dovetail corners, that sort of thing, and this is a good wood for that. Or if you were to do, you know, like when you make stuff with panels, you know, like where you have like the outer frame of something could be made out of oak, the inner panel that fits into it, like for cupboard doors, that sort of thing, out of basswood, because of the stability of the wood, and very few knots in it. You know, it's a good wood. But I got a lot of that to plane. At least the good thing is it planes really easy. It actually is a little hard to cut with the Alaskan sawmill, you know, with a chainsaw, even with a rip blade, because of the lack of grain and the kind of fuzziness of the wood. It tends to clog the chain on the chainsaw. So I always have to cut those rakers way down so it takes a bigger bite so it bites cleanly. And that's only with basswood that I have to do that. But that does the trick then.